Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the H3D Foundation webinar series. Our today's speaker is Dr. Renata Lazarova. Dr. Lazarova works as MD, VP Development, Pediatric Programs at Noema Pharma. As a pharmaceutical leader with clinical experience, Dr. Lazarova is a pediatrician and has comprehensive understanding of pharmaceuticals. Across CRO and major global pharmaceutical companies, Dr. Lazarova has more than 20 years working experience and leadership experience in clinical drug development, regulatory affairs, learning and development, diversity and inclusion, project and program management, and patient engagement. Before we start with the talk, I would like to let you all know that we will have a Q&A session after the talk, so questions can be posted in the chat or kept for the end of the talk. Today's topic is partnering with patients in the development of medicines. And now I would like to request Dr. Lazarova to share her work with us. Over to you, Dr. Lazarova. We can't hear you, Dr. Lazarova. Is anybody else facing this problem in the audience?
Sorry, that was me. I was on mute as it happens. Apologies. So can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So thank you very much for the introduction, Shruti, and very nice meeting you everyone virtually. So good afternoon. And so my name is Renata, and I'm really happy to be here in beautiful Cape Town, at least virtually. My connection to H3D is actually through, goes back a bit for a few years when I was involved in the development of the mentorship workshop or mentorship program for H3D. And now I am a mentor for one of your colleagues. So as Shruti already introduced me, I'm a pediatrician by training. I completed my residence in pediatrics in my home country in Slovakia in Central Eastern Europe. And Switzerland became my second home about more than 20 years ago when I joined the pharmaceuticals, and that became my current actually profession. I'm working in drug development. I will talk about patient engagement today. I will talk a bit about what is it, what is the concept, what is the framework, and I will then share also a specific experience I am making or we made in my current role in the program I run at Noema. And as is mentioned here on the title slide in my disclosure, I am a full-time employee, but what I will present are my personal opinions and experiences and do not necessarily represent all the views of the company. So, so let's start talking about patient involvement or patient engagement. The shape of patient involvement is really changing and developing through the time. So it can be pretty radical, as I tried to express in this picture. And this is how it all started. So patient engagement goes back to 1950s in the United States, where in the cancer treatment, the patients started to actively express their concern whether the frequent blood draws are more helping or maybe more harming them, while the patient who had cancer, they actually were looking for much more holistic treatment rather than more observation of their lab values, but more holistic approach to the disease, considering also their psychosocial aspects that were important to them. So that was the start. The actual advocacy really started to develop as a serious movement at the time of in the 1980s, 90s, when the HIV treatment was being developed. And there was a very strong activist movement in the United States to push the FDA, the American agency, to approve the drugs for HIV and also provide the access to the drug to people who were suffering from the disease. That initiative actually went global, spread went viral in today's terms, spread around the world. And one of the very known examples is also the movement in South Africa that led to providing the affordable treatments, maybe not to absolutely everyone, but to definitely majority of people with HIV around the world. So that's how the movement shaped. So that's one shape of it, is being like really activist movement. Today, we are moving more towards this other view, which is maybe less, definitely less radical. When you look at it, it's more a form of a glossy brochure and kind of strategic concept. So the patient involvement is moving into this more holistic, to have this more holistic approach, where people try to think about what is required. About prerequisites or enablers like funds, budgets, then also on an organizational and human level, mindset, culture, through to what is really important to understand patients, how do you, what are the tactics to be used, and then how do you put it all into a strategy. So it became much more kind of well-described initiative that tries to have this holistic approach. However, the fact remains that we do develop medicines, and then the purpose of medicines is to improve patients' lives. That's really all that drugs do. And if we want to improve patients' lives, we somehow by definition need to understand what they need. And to understand what they need, we need to involve them. As you would in any product development, really, you would want to know what is the end customer thinking and what is the end customer needing. Traditionally, however, the world of healthcare was a little bit more simplistic, maybe, that it was believed that when you go to a doctor, the doctor tells you what to do, what not to do, and the doctor knows. In pharmaceutical, as kind of as a force, let's say in drug development, it's similar thinking. It's thinking, yes, the pharma knows what needs to be done to develop drug, and definitely they know the process. They involve scientists and clinicians, the doctors, to understand the other side. And somehow it was always expected that the doctors will share what patients need. But that's somehow, there is kind of an erroneous concept that someone else should know what someone else thinks and needs. Actually, that is something that patient involvement as an initiative is trying to change. Ask the person who is concerned. Kind of that's the basic concept. There are some basic terms, or just to ensure that we talk about or think about the same thing. So there is this definition of patient. Patient is someone, it's a person who is either having or is at risk of having a medical condition, whether this condition is already being treated or actively prevented through vaccines. That's the patient. There is then a broader term, and that is people living with a disease, which includes the patient, who, by the way, sometimes likes to be addressed as not a patient, which kind of simplifies the personality to just defining the personality by the disease, but more to a person living with the disease, because I am first a person, and then I might have a disease, which adds to all the other characteristics of me as a person. But if we just stay with this patient, so people living with the disease are patients. It's the family who lives around that patient, cares for the patient, and those outside of the family who are caring, that might be institutionalized carers or any other people who are involved, or people who are somehow in contact or interacting with that disease in some way. So this broader group of people is defined as a patient community, just as a large term, a broad term, involving kind of all those different players who are living with the disease. And if this community or subset of that community gets organized in some structural way, then it becomes a patient organization. Patient organizations come in different shapes and forms, from small groups of people who are maybe have a family member with a disease, and they organize to provide support and then start reaching to others through organizations led, or kind of on the other end of the spectrum, are people who lead organizations, structure with a scope of providing support to patients in that specific disease, or providing education. There are some patient organizations that also provide the medicinal product or the treatment, or maybe it's not medicinal product, but treatment options. And kind of on the other end of the spectrum are those organizations and patient groups or advocacy groups that also have influence and do use that influence to increase the visibility, the awareness of the needs of that specific community, that put this community on the political agenda, etc. So I am working, one of the patient organizations is called TSC Alliance, that is a very professional organization that has regional structure providing support, regional structure in the US, providing support for people with tuberous sclerosis. Apologies. That has also an umbrella international organization bringing together all the other countries' organizations and kind of uniting them in that work for tuberous sclerosis, for finding treatment options and improving life of people living with tuberous sclerosis. And they also have a very strong political influence and also a research budget. So patient organizations can also be those really broad, complex organizations. So there is always a spectrum. One more point I want to make here is that you might have also heard me using different terms in those few minutes that I started. We talk about patient centricity, patient engagement, patient involvement, partnership. So these terms I'm using more interchangeably. Of course, there are nuances that differentiate them. How, for example, patient centricity is much more about a mindset, while partnering is more active interaction, active and structured conscious interaction. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will be using these terms interchangeably and talk primarily about patient involvement. So if we think about where we are now, I would like to post it as a problem statement. So currently, patient involvement in research and development process is fragmentary and mostly confined to post-launch or late-stage clinical development. That's when it's being almost always used in those late-stage activities. It's inconsistently used in those early activities. And the stakeholders agree that it would be really effective to ensure that the patient needs are understood and acted on, so really identified and met. However, that very much differs per indication. So as mentioned in cancer, it's very common that patient advocacy is actually very widely, or patient involvement is widely used. Also in orphan disease, where it is sometimes really driven by one person or started by one person, a parent of a patient who just happens to be a drug developer himself. It was a father of a patient who started a patient organization for ultra rare disease. So there is much more kind of connection and unity in those small communities of rare diseases. But there are not so many patient organizations or patient involvement in other indications. There is also a difference in how this approach is being used, and what it results in is sometimes not so efficient drug development. It's not responding to the requirements that patients have. An example here could be originally in multiple sclerosis drugs, one of the key endpoints was time to progression. So while that is an important endpoint as a general term for patient to know what is the time to progression and how does the drug slow that progression. However, what what really matters to patients, much more than just this time to progression, is the time to delaying when the patient needs a wheelchair, because that is a real impact on lifestyle. If you first can walk, and maybe, yes, this is, you have maybe more restrictions, but it's actually a turning point when you need a wheelchair. So this endpoint was introduced into the development of drug for multiple sclerosis, actually based on the input from the patient. So kind of back to what it means if we don't have a more consistent and more structural patient involvement, is that we potentially develop drugs that are not optimal, and that it costs healthcare more money and is actually not bringing the benefit that the developer and the community is actually looking for. So if we have a problem, then there is this hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that routine involvement of patients during the development of medicines will lead to better outcomes. It will lead to developing medicines that are more relevant, that have more impact because they address the outcomes that are relevant to the patient. It might make the development faster. It might lead to a better prioritization in the early research, like when you think of a portfolio level, or when you think about identifying the endpoints. It might help designing the clinical programs. And it also, with addressing the patient understanding and awareness, might lead to accelerated recruitment. Also because if we involve patients into design of the trial, we will understand how to make those trials better. So that's all great, of course, but it's not easy, as is usually the case. So the progress towards this universal framework that would be universally applied for patient involvement would require quite a few things. One is the collaboration. It requires that that there is a partnership of all the players who are involved in this process, or in this continuum rather, and alignment of existing initiatives so that they complement each other. It's the process. So it requires that really patient involvement becomes a foundational principle or guiding principle in the drug development process. And it requires mindset. And maybe that's actually the first thing. It requires the mindset because we need to ensure that patients and their needs are really in the center of in the center of the development of medicines and how we think about it. So here are some examples on a drug development continuum, really on that whole process, starting with early research with chemistry and ending with post-approval activities. So when we look at that process, there are several opportunities for involving patients into that continuum. So starting left to right, in early development, in preclinical development, it is really valuable to understand what is the true unmet need in that specific population, because that will drive the meaningful, development and definition of the meaningful endpoint. It is also important to understand the risk-benefit. What is the accepted risk for what is would be the accepted risk and expected benefit? It also would impact funding. So in understanding or getting a stronger justification or understanding for providing funds, if we understand there is this emotional component of understanding the disease in addition to the scientific definition of the disease. But also patient organization, as mentioned, some of them actually have funds and have research funds and are able to engage further investors or have own funds that they can really apply on the research and development. When it comes then to the later development phase, so starting with designing, developing the programs, understanding what are the needs is again very critical. We talked about about outcomes already, endpoints related to that. It's also important to understand what are the barriers to participation. What is important for the design of a program that will make it possible and maybe not really enjoyable, but acceptable to the patient, for the patient to participate in. Because if we create an awareness of the program, if we explain what expected benefit is and what are the risks as well, it might accelerate the recruitment. It really is significant. We can improve our trial significantly if we understand what the patient is patient and the family, that those people living with the disease, what are they prepared to do when they would participate in the trial. That helps us to improve the study conduct. When it comes to looking at the data analysis, it is important to get the feedback on the result also from the patient community. It is also important that we share the outcome of the trial with the patient community, because there is nothing more motivating for a patient who put his time and effort into being a participant in a trial to then understand what his effort or her effort actually led to. What were the results? Will it contribute to bringing a new treatment maybe to patients very soon? Or maybe it was an exercise that actually didn't lead to desired outcome, but it was an experiment that was successfully completed. So actually that role is very important as well. Plus, patients are very often great participants or contributors to advisory committees, often actively invited to advisory committees, and or providing testimonies, individual testimonies, sharing experiences from the trial, from the treatment, which is especially when you think of the connected society we live in with social media, really very impactful, and both ways. So as an example here, as I mentioned in the tuberous sclerosis trial that I'm working on, we work with a patient organization and they allow us to post on their social media. And there is a specific group of moms with children who have tuberous sclerosis who share experiences on treatment. How did it feel to try this medicine? How did it feel to try that medicine? How was this trial? So the post or the experience shared by a family who says, oh, this was great because it was easy, there were remote visits, so it was really not taking too much toll on the family to participate, has a different effect than an experience that would be shared that says, oh, this is super complicated trial, too many visits, and so that really impacts your trial, and that impacts all those other families, whether they consider your trial as an option or maybe not. So there is this whole continuum of possibilities, and there is much more of where patient involvement can really play a role in drug development. Goes without saying that what is good also has some barriers. So there are several barriers to involving patients in this process on both sides. On one side, on the drug developer side, there is always this limited, not always, there is often, or there might be limited willingness to involve patients. And often it is for reasons related to time and money. Ultimately, it's all about time and money. It's also this sometimes lack of understanding, what can one patient bring me? How do I find that right one patient who will tell me, because I cannot talk to everyone? So there is this concept that you cannot have one patient who represents everyone, which is absolutely true. If you get one patient, they will share their own opinion and experience, but not anyone else's. However, that can be very representative. So that's one element where maybe there is a doubt whether involving patient will really lead to all those great outcomes that we talked about earlier. There is also a conflict of interest and all that confidentiality aspect of how drug developers, whether academic institutions, pharmaceuticals, or else, can interact with patients, because what needs to be considered is the data protection, confidentiality, creating safe space where a patient can share a certain anonymity of the discussion, what happens with the data. So there are a few rules and tactics that you need to consider when you do that. And yeah, money and time, as mentioned, is always an issue too. Because yes, it might take time. So if you plan your process and then you realize, oh, we want to talk to patients, that will cost you time. That's why it's better to plan it from the beginning. On the other side, on the patient community side, there are also several barriers, and one of them is certainly the understanding of the drug development process. It might not be so easy to provide meaningful input if one doesn't understand the drug development context, and we know it's very complex. It is definitely time and resources for patient side as well. The understanding of what are my rights as a patient and how do I represent others. It's a basic health literacy. Not everyone feels and wants and can really be involved in those health discussions. It's the expertise of the actual patient advocacy information, patient advocacy organizations, and it's the access to information in an understandable way for the patient community plays a role as well. So several barriers, and these need to be kept in mind when one is getting into that area. So what's changing slowly but surely, and it's actually not really a new thing anymore, is that regulators are now actively inviting input from specific patients for specific disease areas or programs. So the initiative is called Patient-Focused Drug Development. It's in place for quite some years already. And the patients are invited to either a disease awareness panel, just to present in addition to the clinical kind of knowledge of the disease, their experience with the disease, and also are sometimes members of or participate in the advisory board for specific drug reviews, product reviews, and the FDA also expects the developer to report on which of the activities, into which of the activities the patients were, or in which activities patients were participating. Similar is happening in the European Medicinal Agency that has different working parties, either per disease, per indication, or per patient population group, like pediatric groups, that work along similar lines. And an example here, maybe more on that FDA example, is that there is aducanumab, is a drug that was approved a few years ago by FDA for treatment of Alzheimer's disease, and it was very the clinical benefit wasn't very clear. So it was the first drug that was approved for amyloid plaques, so a new mechanism of action, but the connection between addressing the plaques and the clinical outcomes wasn't clear. But the drug was improved for sure on the basis of scientific data, but also based on or with support of the patient community that was very adamant, stating the need for treatment in this indication. So that is one of the example for one of the effects that patient community has on regulatory decisions. And then just continue beyond this geography, there is a consensus document that was developed by the SIOMS, by Council of International Organization of Medical Sciences, that defines patient involvement and how it is done. It kind of describes best practices in different settings, including resource limited settings, and it covers really global the variety of global settings. There is also a patient public engagement strategy to improve health systems in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is using the existing elements like community advisory boards or community education and community health workers to drive the active engagement of citizens in healthcare in general, and really focusing also on involving patients into that drug development process. So these are some examples, but there are many more, and they come from different levels or different stakeholders rather. There is, for example, health literacy programs, a program from WHO or run by WHO. There are specific expertise and skill building initiatives for patient advocacy groups. There is an interesting initiative run by EUPATI, which is European Patient Training Organization, that focuses on increasing the capabilities of patients and provides training in drug development. What is it, how it's being done, so that the patients who are volunteering to be involved in drug development process have a better understanding of that process, and many more. So there are actually different elements that drive that patient involvement and enables that process becoming really part of what we do. So that was more kind of a general framework. Are there any other questions? I will tell you what I will do after. So I will now talk more about a specific example from what we do in the program that I'm leading. Are there any questions on the general part?
Yes, Dr. Lazarova, there is one question. So Jessica is asking, how does one go about handling potential language barriers in engaging with the patient community? Not only with non-English speaking communities, but also to communicate the scientific language in a way they would understand.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica, for that question. So I think there are two questions really in it. One is the language, and English is very generally and kind of generously used across the scientific community, and I guess across beyond scientific community too. So yes, it needs to be done in a language that patient speaks, either with a translator, or pragmatically one would probably end up selecting patients speaking the language that you can communicate in, or really having those groups done in a local language or in the language of that patient community. So that is one part of the question. The other part is, how do we provide the information to that patient in a language that the patient understands, because we cannot have all patients being scientists, obviously. And there are several initiatives that are asking for appropriate language being used, and these are also part of the study documentation that is required by some agencies. So you have to have, for example, protocol summaries done in a lay language. There is a requirement to run, for example, patient working groups in a language and provide material for those patient groups in a lay language, which is usually defined kind of as a general education level of 12 years old. So really explaining the science in a way that can be understood by that related population. And because it doesn't help if kind of they speak to you in a different language, because you cannot really help, whether that's different in linguistic terms or whether it is in terms of understanding the topic.
So we have no more questions so far, so we can proceed, okay. Dr. Lazarova.
Okay, so here is an example. This is the program that I'm working on, and this is an example of what we do, kind of translating that concept into real life or in our work. So I work for a biotech. We are a small startup I would say small by size, big by ambition. We have 4 clinical assets in clinical development, rare diseases, but not exclusively, or in central nervous system. And I am leading a program that is developing an mGlu5 receptor inhibitor to control seizures associated with tuberous sclerosis complex. So maybe just a word on tuberous sclerosis complex. It's a genetic disorder that is caused by either hereditary or sometimes spontaneous mutations. It leads to growth of tumors, benign tumors in different organs. It impacts heart. Usually there are prenatally identified tumors in heart. That's often the first diagnostic sign if there was no family history. It then usually around birth and in the young age, it impacts the brain and leads to seizures. In later age, it impacts skin, as you see on this picture, and kidneys. And the brain impact and seizure impact is very significant. So about 85% of people with tuberous sclerosis complex have seizures, and 60% of those have seizures that are not controlled by the anti-epileptic treatment, so are treatment resistant and cause obviously significant issues. In addition to seizures, the patients with tuberous sclerosis also have often developmental delays, often psychiatric and behavioral issues such as autism or ADHD and others. So it's really it's a lifelong disease that is changing throughout the times and impacts different systems and impacts whole families. Noema is running a trial called GALENE. Basimgluan is the name of the drug, so mGlu5 receptor inhibitant, developed in children and adolescents with TSC for control of seizures. And maybe just to explain the graphic. So GALENE is the name of the trial, and we selected Galene because Galene is a Greek goddess of calm seas. And that reflects our ambition to contribute to calming those overexcited neurons that cause seizures, hence the name. And then with the name, we developed patient materials explaining to the, in this case, young patient below 12 years age, what is the disease and what is the trial, what it means to be participating in the trial for the patient, and what are the risks, etc. So this is really a child appropriate cartoon where we use the theme of these, etc. So hence the pictures. And I will use those pictures throughout a few upcoming slides. So this is a phase 2b trial, global trial, that is currently ongoing. And we are in the second year of the trial. And Noema is very much believing that partnering with patient is one of the foundational principles. So first you have to understand the biology of the disease and the mechanism of your drug. And if the two match, then kind of the third principle is to understand what are the patient needs. And we tried to apply that principle on our work. We started to work with a patient organization called TSC Alliance, very early when we started to design the program. So we started the development with that indication. My company didn't do the preclinical work. And so we started to work with them when we started to design the program. And as a concrete example, we had a caregiver participating on our advisory board together with the clinicians and scientists. And the caregiver provided not only the experience of what it means to have a child with tuberous sclerosis complex and what it means for the medical symptoms, but also psychosocial impact on the child and on the family and on the broader environment. But she also shared with us what is really important to the community or to people who live with this disease. And that was that while seizures are the most dramatic, especially at the time it happens, it is the most dramatic symptom. And that's why there is a medical need to control the seizures. However, what is much more impacting the family life and the social life of the patient, which on a big scale is actually more significant, and thanks to that input, we introduced the patient-reported outcome that is looking at most impactful symptoms and how can basimglurant, how can our drug impact the most impactful symptoms of the disease. It is exploratory objective, and if we see some kind of a signal in some way, we would be following that and continuing to show that effect. Because we really want to we kind of care for that perspective of the caregiver, that seizures are important, but it's not all. So that was one change or one input, that specific example of an input that we had in the program. We also learned that it is difficult for the family to participate in a trial that has many visits. These trials usually take several months. And so we try to find a balance between in-clinic visits and remote visits, understanding that for a family who has one, maybe more children, and maybe more than one child with tuberous sclerosis, it is really a major challenge to travel to the clinic, especially if it's further with all the travel logistics, etc. We also provided education materials, and I mentioned the example of our cartoon book. So this is the Tom with his mom that is figuring in that material, and also then materials for adults, for the caregiver who needs to have the understanding of the disease, and of course needs different language and different type of information. The study also has open label extension, because one of the barriers to participating in the trials, in the clinical trials, is the double blind. So the patient really appreciates, especially for pediatric trials, the possibility to have an open label part of the trial is very valued. So this is when we started, and we have a continuous relationship with TSC Alliance. So we work with them, we continue to work with them. And they supported us in many of the activities related more to trial conduct. So we worked with TSC Alliance in selecting the sites and countries. So we talked to them about which countries have actually very active this patient community organizations. They helped us to select individual sites in the US. We continue working with them on building awareness, and were able to publish through TSC Alliance channels, educational webinar, a podcast, and Facebook post on their site and similar. So it's really that recruitment support, which is very important in a rare indication. And they also, because they are very, they have this patient-facing part of the organization, so they channel any patients who are interested in the trial to our sites. So it's this ongoing collaboration on the conduct and later on the next stages. So yes, it's a great process, but it has not been smooth sailing all the time. There were some stormy times. The challenges we had were, for example, finding the right balance between what are the remote visits and what are the in-clinic visits, because yes, there is the travel logistics, but there is also the safety monitoring that is required. So we worked with regulators to find the right balance. We had to work with our CRO who supports us to have them understand why we do certain things the way we do it, like the remote visits that require different monitoring. One challenge was to find service providers. For example, DTP is direct-to-patient delivery of clinical supply that had very prohibitive cost and also not really very suitable business models. So there are not many that we could find to ensure that we can deliver the study medication to patients' home. And then time and money. We are a startup, so probably have more finite budget than maybe large, or for sure than large pharma. So it really needs creativity how you get those things done with the pressure on time. And Challenges mean also learning. So we actually learned really a lot from this process, so on the trial. And it's not everything the paradise from the picture, but we actually had great learnings. One is that the patient community is there, but to gain their trust, you really have to be genuinely interacting with them. You have to be open, and you have to, it cannot be that you talk to them once and never again. It has to be really a continuous process. The same applies to clinical sites. Many of them have networks with patients, so among the sites, but also with patients within their regional areas. But it's really important that these are very well aligned and connected. We learned that from our side, so like we as pharma, small pharma, it's really critical to look at this as a long-term relationship building and partnership, not just kind of a ad hoc engagement, but that we really have to be open, authentic when we interact with the community. For the regulators, it means that they sometimes need to think outside of the box of maybe things are not always done the best way as they have been done for the last 20 years. So it's often about finding the way that works for both sides. And service providers also need, I think with creating the need, we will also hopefully there will be also a response in providing the services that are required in a bit different way. So all in all, in closure, patient involvement needs everyone. So yes, pharma has to as a driver of drug development, but I think everyone has to be involved. All patients are insightful. So whether it's an individual or whether it's that sophisticated patient organization, they bring you an insight. And yes, if you have one patient, it's just one, but one is better than none. So patients are very insightful. Patient centricity is a mindset. It cannot be looked at, oh, let's add it to the list of tasks. It's a mindset that goes throughout the process. And we have to listen and act on what patients tell us. We cannot only pick and act on things that are good for us. Sometimes the input means that some things it's more complicated. And sometimes we also are not able to implement what the patient suggests. But then we have to be really open and explain in an understandable language, why we cannot do what they are suggesting. Because reality is you cannot do everything. So these were the learning from the process. And that also concludes my presentation for today. So let me know if you have any questions.